So if you do have some kind of failure, you're going to need to do a recovery. So a server recovery can mean a recovery of a single file or folder or a full server restore. So the server recovery procedures for recovering files, folders, and volumes, or a system state recovery, or a bare metal recovery, and Windows recovery environment. We're going to cover these in this slide deck, as well as the configuring boot configuration data, or configuring boot configuration data. My apologies. So we're going to cover these in this slide deck. So first, let's talk about recovering files, folders, and volumes. If you restore single files often because of human error, it may be best to enable shadow copies feature on volumes storing those types of files that users need to periodically restore, and that allowed users to restore these files themselves without system administrators even getting involved in some cases. You may need to restore an entire volume because of a system corruption or a failed drive. So you can use the wbadmin start recovery command or the start wb file recovery PowerShell commandlet to recover in that way. So a system state recovery is basically so when you do a system state recovery, this is usually if you're just need to recover the state of a role. So for example, I was talking about IIS in the previous slide deck. If you did a system state backup for IIS, then if you make some kind of settings change in IIS and it stops working, which is the web server in Windows, as we learned about in the previous course, if you did something that made it stop working, you could just do a system state recovery to get back to the previous configurations that you were at for IIS. Now, as I said, that wouldn't recover the files associated with IIS, but it would at least recover all of the settings and all that sort of thing. So you can get back to where you were, but the actual websites will still be the same. So it is important, no matter what role you're looking at or what feature you're dealing with, mostly roles when we do this though, it's important to understand the role. And one of those is Active Directory. So, Active Directory, if you do a system state backup, everything that you need for Active Directory for domain controller is going to get backed up. But when you do a restore, you have some special options. There's an authoritative restore, which means if you restore one of your domain controllers using an authoritative restore, then it's going to assume that after its restore is complete, that it becomes the source of truth, and it's going to push out all of everything it knows about the about Active Directory to all the other servers. It's going to distribute that to all the other servers. So but if you do a non-authoritative restore, then it's going to restore the Active Directory role, but it's going to allow that server to get updates from other servers to get it back up to speed. So, so an authoritative restore is good if, let's say something happens with Active Directory and you know that everything is corrupt. There's something's going on and you're not sure what happened, but either way, maybe you made a settings change or something, and maybe in group policy, and all of a sudden people can't do some certain task. You don't want to, for some reason you can't figure out what happened. You just want to go back to a previous state. If you do a non-authoritative restore, then it's not going to help because even though you restore one domain controller, it's going to get all of the updates of everything that you've done from the other servers anyway. So, by its nature, Active Directory is distributed and prevents that type of thing from happening. So if you wanted to make sure that you go back to a known configuration for Active Directory, you'd have to do an authoritative restore, which will then push, will then bring everybody to the level at the last backup that you did, the last backup system state backup that you did on that particular domain controller. So as a consequence, if your system state backup was from last week, that means all of the changes you've made since last week are going to go away. If you do that. So it's important to be aware of authoritative versus non-authoritative if you're doing an Active Directory restore for system state recovery. So some other types of recoveries, if you recall, we also talked about a bare metal recovery or a bare metal backup. So you could do a bare metal recovery if you have a bare metal backup. So you would do this if you've had some catastrophic failure and you have to restore the entire server back to the way it was. Not just a particular role or some particular files. So this is the entire server. So you would have to, in order to do this, you have to be able to boot to the Windows installation. And if you're running on a VM, you're going to have to use the ISO file for the install. So you do have to have an install disk available for this. And I can't stress enough, that it's important if you're an administrator to make sure you have all of the installation disks for all the different versions of Windows Server, Windows Workstation, and all the different software that you're running It's important to have that installation media because Microsoft is going to be basically useless to you if you lose the media. They're really not going to be able to help you at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to recover something. I've been there, and Microsoft is utterly useless, and they will do nothing to help you unless you have a credit card with and you're willing to drop a couple $1,000s to talk to somebody to give you an ISO file. But um, if you're looking for a particular version of an ISO file for a particular OS, sometimes it's nearly impossible to get that from Microsoft's website. They've made some changes in their websites over the last couple of years, and it's become very difficult to use their websites. Microsoft just overall kind of sucks as a company as far as support goes, in my opinion. But they do have some good products, but their support structure is not very good. Their customer service is not what it used to be. So using the Windows recovery environment, this is another option. Um, so with Windows recovery environment, you can use a special boot option to solve Windows startup problems rather than having to recover, do a bare metal recovery. This started with, it comes standard with Windows Server 2012 R2, Windows 8, 8.1, Windows 10, obviously Windows 2016, and so forth. So if 2012 R2 fails to start twice in a row, then Windows RE is going to start automatically. Also, if you have two unexpected shutdowns within 2 minutes of a successful boot, right? So if the machine booted up successfully, but then all of a sudden shuts down for some reason, it could be a blue screen of death, right? Which we don't see those much anymore. But some system exception happens and the machine just shuts down. If that happens twice within 2 minutes, then it's going to automatically go into the recovery mode because something is obviously wrong if that happens. And I've had that happen where I didn't even know that a machine went down in that way. Maybe it rebooted once or twice, and then it goes into recovery mode, and we don't find out about it until somebody reports the outage, and then look at that, it's sitting in recovery mode because something happened. So Windows RE includes a whole bunch of tools. There's the push button reset, system image recovery, command prompt, advanced troubleshooting tools, which include BCD edit, BCD boot, boot rec, disk part, bootsect, SFC, which recovers all of the system files, and some startup settings. So it looks like this, right? So this is, and you get to this screen. These are the boot options. You can also get to the screen manually if you hit F8. I think when the machine is starting up, you can get into that mode. But like I said, it's going to go into that mode automatically if the machine automatically reboots more than a few times, or if it crashes more than a few times, it'll end up in that screen waiting for you to do something. So in the options in the menu, you can do safe mode. There's safe mode with networking. By default, safe mode doesn't allow networking. So safe mode with networking and safe mode with command prompt, so you can at least do things in the command prompt. You can enable boot logging, which sometimes will tell you where it's failing during the startup. So if the startup is failing somewhere, at least with the boot logging, go and pull that log file and try to analyze it. You can do low resolution video. That way you can eliminate any issues with drivers. Last known good configuration, so it can just revert back to the last time it booted and go back to those configurations if they're available. Directory services repair mode, debugging mode, disable automatic restart on system failure, disable driver signature enforcement, so you can use unsigned drivers, or you can disable early launch anti-malware drivers. Sometimes those can cause problems with the boot up process. And finally, if you think nothing's wrong and you just want to try booting it up again, you can start Windows normally. Sometimes that actually works, right? So sometimes you can just start it normally and everything is fine. But there's, obviously we like to do some root cause analysis to find out what the real issue was. But you could certainly do a normal start as well. So the boot configuration data store contains settings that determine how a Windows system boots. It's usually on a reserved partition, and before Windows 2008 and Vista, it was stored as a plain text file called boot.ini, but starting in 2012, it's a little bit different. So it contains entries describing each installed operating system that can be started by the bootloader, and each entry is identified with a GUID that must be referenced if you want to change an entry. So that's the main tool for working with BCD is going to be the bcdedit.exe. In the old days, we used to just use Notepad with boot.ini, but now you have to use bcdedit, and then you can edit some of the boot options. So Some of the option in BCD edit is enum, copy, create, delete, export, import, set, default, timeout. So again, you're going to run this from the command line if you need to use this. But with that command, you can manage files related to the boot process. So for example, you could initialize the system partition with BCD files from eWindows folder, and it creates a boot entry in the BCD store for the operating system. In other words, if you know that whatever machine it is that you want to boot is eWindows, and you could have multiple versions of an operating system on the same machine. So you could have an like a C Windows System, C Windows 2008, it's C Windows 2012, and when your computer boots, you can pick which one you want to run. Although typically we don't do that. Maybe have it default to one of them. Usually you would do this like with a testing machine or something. Just give you an idea of what this would look like if you were using it. So you could point this to a boot partition and say, I have an operating system in this folder. This is where you're going to boot it from, and it'll use that. This command is going to copy the BCD files from, say, C Windows to the system partition on the V drive. So you can move those files if you wanted to. This is going to set the locale in the BCD store to Japanese. So if you want to start it in the Japanese language. I've had cases where I have to go back to English because some software doesn't work right in another language, so I just have to get it back to English. So I'll run the command to move it back to English US or something like that. So online backups. In the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about how to do online backups.